those are wonderful talks. Absolutely wonderful. I was scribbling down notes. I've decided to try and be an iPad person. And so scribbling on a digital tablet, because I actually wrote a little note here that I've never got on with analog art. Like anything which didn't have an undo key wasn't for me. And so since I've found digital animation and anything else, I've actually felt that I've become more of an artist. But my father, think about archive, deleted 100 megabytes of Mac Paint artwork that I had created as a child on the original Mac Plus. And I remember being so upset that this collection, this artwork that I'd created is now gone. There's no way of it ever coming back. It wasn't burnt in a fire. He deleted it to make space for a game he was probably installing or something like that. But it could have kept it. I could have opened it now. That digital art form could have been moved on and migrated between mediums. But I guess the first question really is, in a world with a lot of content being created, how do we decide what's worth keeping? Anybody welcome to jump in.
Okay. Thank you. Well, funny enough, Ippolito referred to that. He was asked the same question at one stage, and he said, well, firstly, there are some works that are designed to be ephemeral anyway, and he said you should look at those, sort of, and perhaps sort of appreciate that. And one example I've got is Gustav Metzger, obviously famous for his autodestructive art, but was also very much involved with computer art at one stage, and he proposed a piece that he called 5 Screens for Computer that involved a very big metal framework in a field, with large blocks of steel inside it. It was designed to be rusted anyway, but it was also controlled by a computer that at random moments would eject bits of itself into, up to 5 or 6 meters away. So a very dangerous and large thing, but it would also destroy itself over a period of years, and it would do so just by means of random numbers. So, I mean, how do you conserve that? It's a very...
And should you want to curate that? How do we decide what content should be kept? I mean, you've been doing a lot of XR work. Is every piece that comes through XR have to be kept because it's meaningful to the future of humanity?
Yes.
Punchy?
It's a really good question. I mean, it's all still very Wild West at the moment, and there's a lot of stuff that probably isn't going to go down in history as the most groundbreaking thing overall, but probably was very groundbreaking for the people that made it at the time, and they learned so much from it, and will probably themselves look back at it and think, wow, remember when I thought that was a great idea? And there's a lot of that. I think I was talking to somebody earlier, I think Stephen from the BFI. We were sort of drawing a parallel with, what did we keep from the early days of film, and was it enough? And do we think we should have done anything differently or recorded more of it? I don't know the answer to that question actually, but is there anything that we can learn at this point that would say that maybe we should be trying to keep hold of a bit more of this than we currently are? I think another thing I would actually point out on this is we're not just about keeping it; it's just about even getting hold of it and distributing it. So a few years ago, everybody I met was just make it. Just make it. Doesn't matter if nobody sees it. We'll just make it, and it'll be really cool, and we'll get an award or something. And that was enough. That was fine. Now it's make and distribute. It's just trying to get it to people. You mentioned Carnet and Iarena. I've not seen that. It's never been in the UK. I know almost nobody I know has seen it. I've heard about it. I want to see it, but it's even working in the industry. I can't see most of it. So we haven't even quite got to the keep part yet. But actually, I think we probably should be.
With that particular piece, because it is such a physical space and it's an installation, you would have to reimagine it in a type of virtual reality that was more accessible. It was the only way to get it to exist again. Similarly to the machine that destroys itself over time, it was about the moment, the time, in that space. And VR can be used actually as content itself, but it also can be used to capture moments and capture galleries and capture artworks for people to reimagine down the line. Is there anything you can talk about in that area? Reimagining? Well, capturing galleries and using virtual reality to bring an artwork as the medium for the future.
Thank you. So I can talk about it in relation to a project that our students at LCC are working on at the moment. So the Dulwich Picture Gallery has an exhibition of Solberg on for a little while still, and they run late evening event to encourage people to come, and they're trying to bring in a younger audience. So they've paired up with us this year, and this is in relation to the industry briefs that I mentioned in my presentation, where we collaborate with industry to create briefs and educate our students on how it is in the real world so they're prepared. So we've organised this collaboration with the Dulwich Picture Gallery. The students were given all the information about Solberg and asked to pitch an idea in virtual reality, but with a physical element so that visitors also had something to look at when they didn't have a headset on, but in response to Solberg's artwork. And it could be one painting, it could be multiple paintings. And I think, I feel like it's relative to this conversation because it's taking something physical that is fairly old and putting it into a new context in virtual reality, but also adding on to it. Some of the students have used direct visuals from the painting, so they've replicated the painting in a 3D space, and therefore you can stand within the painting. But some students have sort of been influenced by it and then gone in a completely different direction, and kind of opening it up to a much younger audience where it's more playful. But it's still all influenced by that original artwork.
That's great. We spoke on the phone a little while ago about the idea of virtual field trips, and there was that idea of capturing and recreating kind of Egyptian tombs and that sort of thing, and using virtual reality to bring you, again, using the idea of presence, using the idea that instead of being told a story, we're actually seeing a story and we're actually being there, something different. What do you think the interplay between using virtual reality as the medium to view art and it being art itself? I know you've been looking at lots to kind of capture that sort of stuff.
Well, I think in that area, I mean, I've seen some of the work done by, say, Sarah Kenderdine. She's done a lot of recreations of places that can't be easily visited, like the caves at Dunhuang in China, which are actually it's a big place on the Silk Road, large Buddhist sort of caves that now obviously are being damaged by time and by other sort of problems. So, in fact, capturing them they use LiDAR, they use gigapixel cameras. They've made probably as good a representation of those as could be done at the high end. And then the medium in which she shows that is actually, it's partially full dome, so you can walk in without glasses, but you can also use tablets inside there for a form of augmented reality as well. So in some ways, what you see there, you can actually get to more things more easily and see them in possibly higher fidelity than if you were in the caves themselves. And I actually, curiously enough, I think that what Kenderdine does actually border on a work in itself. It's obviously done in the context of a museum. It's done as a piece of sort of, it's done as an exhibit. But in some ways, her interpretation also, I think, sort of might actually qualify it as perhaps a work of art in its own right. So I think the boundaries between those things are often quite porous, and sometimes over time we assign more value to things as they sort of recede into the distance, like the Sensor, for instance. It sort of rises to become a bit more even important than it seemed at the time when it was made. So I was going to say, in terms of significance, although we might want to perhaps assign it to what the industry says is significant or what is promoted perhaps the most at a given time, in later years, what shakes out is actually often quite different.
Do you think a simulation of Sensor in virtual reality would be comparable to the artwork itself?
Yes, I think so. I mean, but I had to say that, I had to be able to see the physical Sensor, which, funnily enough, for about sort of 15 years, I'd only ever been referring to very grainy illustrations and little bits of film. Actually, to be honest, seeing the physical presence means that I can now sort of say with some sort of sense, yes, it is significant in its form and size, but I could imagine it being shown in a virtual space and probably having the same impact.
And I guess a lot of it's to do with some of this artwork that we're talking about is the first time it's being seen, and the first time something of that scale or that complexity or that technical, whatever it may be, where we as humans experience something different. And so a big physical robot that's kind of AI itself coming and kind of lunging around you in space is probably quite an amazing thing to feel. And I not to belittle it, but now you'd see it could probably be produced more easily, more cheaply than anything else.
Yeah, I think on a similar vein, I sort of touched on it in my talk, was about the way I've seen archive used, so not art necessarily, but important cultural material. I mean, a couple of examples of this. The BBC made a piece called Berlin Blitz that used a piece of real audio, a real audio recording from inside a Lancaster bomber going over Berlin. Berlin in 1943, and they dug it out of their archive and they made a whole experience around it. So they've created an environment in which another form of archive material can now be experienced in a totally new way, in a completely probably a much more immersive way than simply just listening to it on, on the radio or something. Another piece, the one I mentioned, the Common Ground piece about the Aylesbury estate. Again, they've dug up all sorts of 2D, like filmed footage, archive footage from years of reports about this estate. They've also made some of their own new material and like one-on-one sort of testimonials from residents of the estate. And again, they've just used that as a jumping off point to make a completely new experience. So it's kind of both of those things. It is an artwork in itself, but it's also a way of bringing another form of media to life.
I guess that goes back to what you were talking about, storage, migration, emulation, and reinterpretation. And the reinterpretation is a new form of the artwork. I was chatting to one of the chaps at the V&A, and he was saying they had the second best David in the world. And that was a bold statement. And he said, well, ours was actually a mould from the original, and so ours is as close as you can possibly get, and you're not allowed to do that anymore because it damages the original artwork. And I said, well, if you can do a sub-millimeter 3D scan, I could 3D print one from the original, which I think would be even more close to the original. And then you get into this idea of digital clones and that sort of stuff. How long should we keep this stuff for if we're going to curate it? Surely we're just going to produce more data and more than anyone could ever fathomly consume. I'm not sure how many millions of hours are on YouTube at the moment, but there's not an opportunity to watch it all. And how do we decide how long should we keep this stuff?
I kind of feel like, do we have to decide? Because we have the ability to store all this data. The fact that everything that has ever been on YouTube since it was started is still there, or some of it may have been deleted because people got embarrassed by it, but it could still be there. Yes, we would need to watch everything to know how to curate it if we choose to sift through it and pick out specific pieces. But because this is digital, we don't necessarily have to choose what we keep and what we don't keep. It can all just be kept until we have use for it, maybe.
I mean, there is that. I mean, we don't need to necessarily watch everything ourselves. Of course, with AI, that can gradually do some of the watching for us and actually, just discover what's there that we can't possibly have the time to see in the sort of shortness of our own mortal span. So, I mean, there is the possibility. I think the key thing, what I'm saying, is navigation and metadata. You want to be able to find your way to it, or at least know similar things. Because, I mean, I'm a big believer in serendipity, and some of the stuff I've found is just because it happened to rub up against things I knew about already, but I would never have found it otherwise.
It's true. I guess it's about, and I guess that comes back to the role of the curator and the gallery. And it used to be you'd have one or two or three very prominent galleries in every city in the world, and they'd fight over incredibly expensive pieces of artwork for their displays. And now art has kind of progressed into so many other amazing and strange and wonderful mediums that there is a huge number of galleries. And I guess it's the curation. So maybe talk a bit about that, about how the different types of artwork exist and how do we find our way through. I think it's interesting about letting AI look through our artwork to decide the things that we should see or not see.
I was more thinking of it just sort of tagging things rather than making that decision for us. I was only saying that as long as something is tagged, you can at least find it. I still firmly believe that those sort of decisions of quality or other types of judgments, in a way, depend on the contextual knowledge that humans have. We can't sort of farm that out. And I think context is the big thing that AI can't do very well. It can do expert learning, it can do other types of knowledge, but I think, removed from context, and as somebody mentioned earlier, empathy as well, and I think background understanding, there's a lot that AI will not be able to do for the foreseeable, I think.
Very true. I was talking to a friend of mine about artificial intelligence being able to be creative, and he was very staunchly telling me that creativity is a human thing, and it can't possibly learn it. I said, well, my creativity is based on all of everything I've learned to this point, and I make decisions on how I create art from that point onwards. He said, well, what about the human essence of randomness and inspiration? I said, well, that's just a slider in AI. How random do you want to be from 0 to 100%, and it'll go off target to find you things that are interesting and kind of out of your scope. So I think AI for tagging and metadata, but also for curating, could be quite a powerful thing to bring us all the artworks from around the world and put them into one space. One of the things I touched on earlier was the idea of value and valuable artworks and things that we consider priceless because they are the only one that ever existed in the world. Do we think artwork has to have a value, and is scarcity the most important thing that has driven us to this point? Oh, shake your head, I like that.
I think when we're talking about art, value is not its monetary value. That is not the sole value that art has. Everything that we create has some kind of value, whether it's to the creator because it's a thing that came from them, or whether it's to lots of people because they engage with it. And personally, I don't think it's a bad thing if we steer away from the idea that because something is rare, it should cost more money, which then means it's less accessible, we shouldn't duplicate it. If something is beneficial on any level to us as a society or to the world or whatever, then I make more of it, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. Basically, I think it's interesting. I think obviously there is a value in something that is kind of has an exclusivity around it, of course, and many businesses survive off that principle actually as well. But I think. I don't think we're at the point yet, certainly with VR and stuff, where we can easily sort of decide what kind of value it has at this moment. I think it's very early. I wanted something occurred to me then as we were talking, just about a kind of interesting tussle maybe between. Well, it was a question about what responsibility is there on the creator to be making things that are scalable and curatable and archivable, you know. It's interesting, I was at a film festival last year and I thought there was a quite marked split between pieces that were super complex and really, really cool, but really like complicated, difficult productions to pull off that not many people will ever see, and stuff that was just strong, great, well-executed entry-level VR that you could scale and put on loads of different platforms. And it's really interesting because if you're chasing a business model, if you want to get this to people, then that's the way you go. But on the other hand, the other stuff was some of the best stuff I've ever seen. So, you know, maybe it's too early to start putting any kind of standards on it, but on the other hand, if you're a creator and you want your things to be seen, you've got to make some choices about that as well, about how easy to make it for people. It's a really interesting debate.
Well, I believe art should make you feel something, either love it or hate it. If it doesn't make you feel something, I don't believe it has value, personally. Everyone's got an argument to put with it. But when we look at blockbuster content and blockbuster movies, it's to make as many people happy as possible, and it doesn't really do that at all. It kind of middle of the road, and everyone kind of goes, I kind of liked it. But you go into some pieces of art, some movies, and you come out fundamentally like you've had an earth-shattering experience. You've changed your point of view on the world. It might be that you really frickin' hated it and you never want to see one of those things again, or it might be that you love it. And I think virtual reality has the same stuff at the moment, where we're still experimenting to create the content that is meaningful. That looks like time is up. I had one other question that you wanted me to ask. What are the career options? Bluntly, is this a place where artists can create money for once? Or are we still in the place where the term struggling artist means working in a coffee shop and doing something you love? You're training the next group.
From my experience, there is a lot of money in virtual reality and augmented reality, mixed reality. But the money that's being pumped into the industry at the moment is in commercial work. It's by companies who are understanding that training in virtual reality is much cheaper. There's a company who had an oil rig and they needed to train their new employees. And instead of shutting down the oil rig and running a training sequence for a day, they just had a company create a VR experience where you could do that. So there's tons of money in that. There's money in the medical sector. There's money, like I said, in education. I think where the money is lacking and where the struggling artist probably still comes into it is how do we get money to create pieces that are artistic rather than for any specific purpose like training. And that, I think, is the question and the struggle for current artists.
Well, I mean, if some of the media artists from the early 2000 or anything to go by, they tend to do that in the sort of field of design, for instance, or, you know, sort of making things which are more commercial or sort of in the applied arts, and then do their art elsewhere. You know, I mean, I think it's quite possible to deploy your skills in one area and then sort of utilise that sort of extra, if indeed they have any extra time to do the other things that they do. But I've seen all sorts of ways. I mean, I think the trouble is just sort of drawing a sort of circle around a small area and saying that's the art. But in fact, I think it's a much broader sort of area, that some of which will eventually emerge as art, other parts of it are more craft. I mean, some things are actually sort of, you know, they're beyond that scope, but they will inform what what art is done.
I think, well, for a career path, I'm never sure I'm a good person to ask, because I think no job I've ever had has existed 2 years before I've had it. You know, like I don't know how I've done this, but I've always ended up going this weird way where these jobs kind of just get created. And I think that will probably be true of my next job and the one after that as well, which is an interesting space to play in. But I think in terms of the sort of supporting artists and getting them being paid for their work, it's hard for everybody working in this area right now. But I will say that, you know, it's fantastic that organisations like Arts Council England are really thinking hard about the way that they support this kind of thing. And you know, having worked so closely with them in the last couple of years, it's, you know, been fantastic to see how open they are being to the way they define this and the type of people they work with, because they recognise, as we do, you know, if I looked across the 20 companies on the last Creative XR cohort, that no two are the same. That, you know, you have established animation studios, you've got groups of freelancers making stuff together, you've got universities and theatre companies, and none of them are the same, and they all need different skills. So we've got to be more open about who artists are and what these teams actually look like, and therefore the way that we fund and support them.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for sharing knowledge with the audience.